Welcome back to another one of your flip lectures. In today's flip lecture, we're going to talk about the era of nationalism and of change that took place after the War of 1812. And as we discussed in class, in the aftermath of the War of 1812 was an era known as, well, the era of good feelings. It was a time where Americans had strong national unity as well as a high amount of nationalism. The War of 1812 also saw the rise of American prestige overseas and the belief in the strength of the United States as an international power. And the first topic we're going to discuss is American expansion in foreign policy. And we're going to talk about a couple of subtopics within this. The first thing I want to talk about is Spain and Florida. In the year 1818, as you can see on the map, both the area that is now the American Southwest was owned by Spain, as well as the now state of Florida. And Florida had always been kind of a sore spot for the United States because it was the only territory that Spain controlled in that part of the American continent. And what really upset the United States was that the Spanish were not really paying close attention to Florida. They weren't in control of their borders, and this led to Seminole Indians, who were actually Creek Indians who fled to Florida after being pushed off their land by American settlers. They would use Florida, and especially the swamps in Florida, as a base to raid American towns. So basically they would plan attacks, and then they would raid Georgia and other American states in the South. So in 1818, General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, he was given the go-ahead to actually invade Spanish Florida. And the goal of this was only to attack and defeat the Seminoles who had been attacking settlements in Georgia. However, throughout the course of this invasion, the United States took over Spanish towns and eventually kind of conquered Florida. What happened in the aftermath was that Spain actually negotiated with the United States to give up control of Florida and actually negotiated a new southwest border with the United States. So this is an interesting time where the United States is actually invading Florida and trying to take it from a European power, Spain. And kind of the invasion of Florida and the Seminole Wars. They're kind of forgotten episodes in American history, but this was really important at the time because it showed the United States really asserting itself, both domestically and internationally, by trying to take care of the Seminoles by fighting the Seminole War as well as dealing with Spain. Another instance of the United States asserting itself on the world stage is what became known as the MONROE Doctrine, named after President James Monroe. And what the MONROE Doctrine said was that American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. So basically, the United States government came out saying that they would intervene, they would get involved if any European power tried to invade, conquer, colonize anywhere in the Americas. As you can see in the political cartoon, it's the MONROE Doctrine dropping the hat on kind of Central and South America, saying that the United States wouldn't allow for Europeans to colonize the Americas any further. And the reason for this, the reason for the MONROE Doctrine, is that after Spain lost control of Mexico and Florida, so Mexico had their war for independence and they won it, the United States was supporting those new Latin American countries and was trying to weaken European rule over that part of the world. Other European countries thought that these revolutions were a threat. They would lose their colonies, they would lose their monarchies, they would lose their whole system of government to these revolutions. And so the European countries actually considered helping Spain retake Mexico and retake Florida. And so the young United States, wanting to keep Europeans out of American affairs, published this MONROE Doctrine to try to prevent European influence in the Americas by pledging to fight any European country that tried to colonize. So the MONROE Doctrine, along with kind of the annexation of Florida, is a good example of how the United States became more assertive, more aggressive in their dealings with the rest of the world. And so the million-dollar question is, why did U.S. foreign policy become so assertive? We're going to talk about that in class. So see if you can answer that question for yourself. Now we're going to shift gears to economic changes that came as a result of this period after 1812. And the first instance is that the Bank of the United States was brought back. They created a new national bank. This was the forerunner for the Federal Reserve System. And the Second Bank of the United States was given the power to control state banks, issue currency, and especially loan money to the U.S. government. So ask yourself, why would the United States see the need for a national bank? Just like that question before, see if you can come up with the answer to that question on your own. After this War of 1812 as well, the Industrial Revolution really picks up steam in the United States. The American system of government and economics really kind of allowed for the United States to expand very rapidly. There's a lot of individual freedom for people to create businesses, which led to rapid growth. Also, the United States had very low taxes, and if you have lower taxes, if you're not paying money to the government, you have more capital, which you all remember is money that you use to spend on a business. Also, the system of free enterprise, where individuals can create businesses, always leads to competition. And if you're competing against other people, you're always going to be willing to try new technology in order to gain an edge. So all of these kind of factors help the Industrial Revolution take hold. This also begins to change the United States. In the development of cities, industry starts to develop in the north, surrounding basically the rivers and the concentration of population. And remember, this divides the north and the south and helps lead to the Civil War. And also, a very big change is that people who didn't own property could actually have a lot of money. As professional classes as well as labor classes rise, you no longer need to actually own property in order to have money in the United States. And with money comes influence. So now we're going to shift gears again. I'm going to bring up a couple of political changes. And the first of these political changes has to do with the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest authority on the laws of the country. And the Supreme Court, during this period of time, really expanded the power of the federal government over the states, and really just expanded the power of the national government in general. So, why do you think the Supreme Court would do this? Again, this is a question for you to answer on your own to talk about tomorrow. And the first one of these Supreme Court cases I want to talk about is Marbury v. Madison in 1803. This is probably considered the most important Supreme Court decision, because it's this decision that establishes the concept of judicial review. Now, what judicial review means is that the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution and declare laws to be unconstitutional. Before this, the Supreme Court really didn't do much. But after Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court now became the best authority, the highest authority, on whether or not laws in the United States were constitutional. The second Supreme Court case I want to mention is McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. And McCulloch v. Maryland is important because the Supreme Court decision interpreted the Constitution to say that the United States government had implied powers. And implied means that they weren't expressly written, but that, well, they were implied, that they should be there without having to say them. And so this idea would give the United States Congress more power than was specifically written in the Constitution. Because the Constitution is very narrow in what it allows the federal government to do. But this ruling gave the Congress a lot more authority. And actually this expansion, this implied powers, is still a really big issue today, and was actually at issue in the recent debates over the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. And the reason that the Supreme Court gave the Congress more power than was given to them in the Constitution is because in the actual Constitution, there are two lines that say that the government is to provide for the general welfare, and the Supreme Court said sometimes that includes doing more than is in the Constitution, and also it says to make laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out that Constitution. This is also known as the Elastic Clause. And it basically gives the United States government a lot more leeway to do things than they previously had. But again, I bring it back to the original question, why would the Supreme Court expand the power of the national government during this era? Also during this time, you have an expansion of voting rights. In 1824, only 355,000 votes were cast. Then, by 1828, 1.1 million votes were cast for president. By 1840, 2.4 million votes were cast for the presidential election. And let me tell you, folks, it's not just because there were more people. In the early 1800s, in most states, you actually had to own property to vote. But non-property owners lobbied for expanding voting rights. And eventually suffrage would be extended to all white men. But still no women, and still no free blacks or other minorities. But the question is a question for you to answer, why would voting rights be expanded? See if you can figure it out based on what we've previously talked about. Now I kind of really briefly want to talk about women's successes and struggles in the early 1800s, because this is important to understanding kind of the trajectory of the identity of women in the United States. So during the early 1800s, there was an idea called true womanhood, also known as the cult of domesticity. And what this basically said was that there was two parts to life. There was home and there was work. And true womanhood said that the woman's place was not at work, that a woman's place was in the home. That the outside world was considered to be too corrupt and dangerous for women. And women were considered to be more moral and virtuous. And so kind of women at this time were expected to basically stay at home, keep the house, and to raise virtuous children. That was a really important part of this, was educating virtuous American children. But true womanhood actually, in some cases, had the opposite desired effect. And some women saw the idea of true womanhood as giving them a much more important role in society, as making them equals, as making them a voice on what was right and wrong in society. And so early women's movements started to form, because these women believed that they needed the influence in order to fulfill this role. So women started lobbying for equality and for political rights during this period. And actually they would win laws that basically allowed women to own property and other things like that. So in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention happens. And this is the first major organized women's movement in the United States. And their efforts are going to focus especially on the right to vote. And they're going to start to lobby for equality. And in their declaration at this convention, they say that all men and women are created equal. So though it would take a long time, until 1920, for women to get the vote, and much longer for women to be accepted equally in American society, kind of the way that things develop for women, this idea of kind of true womanhood, coupled with the desire for more political influence, really kind of sets the stage for future women's rights movements. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about slavery during this period. So before kind of this period of time, slavery was actually starting to die out in the United States. It wasn't that efficient, cash crops weren't really selling as much. But then something happens that expands slavery significantly in the United States. An invention known as the cotton gin. This allowed for people to remove seeds from cotton very quickly and very efficiently. Before that, it would take a person an entire day to make just one basket full of cotton. After this, things would go a lot more efficient. And because Europeans had been creating factories for textiles, which is cloth to make clothing, cotton was in very high demand in Europe. And so where there's a dollar to be made, people are going to make it. And so this demand for cotton in Europe, coupled with this cotton gin and the efficiency of cotton production, led to a massive expansion of the slave trade, from 1.5 million to 4 million slaves. And though the international slave trade was actually banned, there were no more new slaves from Africa, the slave trade still expanded, because all new slaves in the United States were actually born into slavery. And the slave system became very brutal. As people moved to protect their economic interests, they passed slave codes restricting things that slaves could do. They were also treated as property legally, and they were significantly dehumanized during this period of time. And so it's interesting that kind of slavery really rises up as an issue, a major issue in the United States, because of kind of economics and this new invention and demand for cotton from Europe. And the slavery as you all know, is going to lead to the American Civil War. And it's going to lead the country to have to decide what it believes about the nature of human freedom and what it believes about who is American. So just a brief summary. Some changes in the young United States after the War of 1812. The United States pursued further expansion and a much more assertive and aggressive foreign policy. The United States also created a new nationalized banking system. They experienced changes because of industrialization. We saw the Supreme Court expand the power of the federal government. And you also saw the expansion of voting rights to more Americans. But despite these changes, women continued to struggle to gain equal status in the United States, and even to gain the vote. And an increased emphasis on slavery was going to increase the number of slaves, the brutality of slavery, and this was going to contribute to the later American Civil War. So, I encourage you guys to look back at those questions now that you've gone through the whole flip lecture and see if you can answer them.